an old-fashioned winter supper. Today we'll be making vegetable beef soup, homemade bread, and fresh baked apple pie. We'll first be starting with making a stock. I start my stock the day before. You'll need to start with a baking sheet of some sort. We're going to need some beef bones, which these are grass-fed beef bones for making soup. We'll need celery and carrots and a couple of onions. We're going to need pepper and salt. Let's start by getting these rinsed off. Keep the skins on the onions and rinse them well. We'll be using approximately 4 soup bones. When cutting the celery, set the tops to the side. I'll be cutting the vegetables in about 3-inch sections. Now I'm going to place the tops of the celery in a Ziploc bag and place them in the fridge till later in the second part of making the soup. I'm going to cut the onions in quarters, leaving the skins on. We'll be adding pepper to the top. And also a generous helping of salt. I'm using a sea salt. Now into the oven. We'll roast them at 375. Now we're going to start a chuck roast in the crock pot. This will be used for the meat of the soup. I'll place it in the crock pot with about a cup of water, 1 to 2 onions, depending on the size, some pepper, and about 1.5 teaspoons of salt. We'll cover it and let it cook on low. The vegetables and the beef bones have now been roasting for a little over 2 hours, depending on your oven. You want to make sure that your vegetables are nice and tender and that the bones are cooked thoroughly. Now we're going to add them to a stock pot with water added to it. Now remember to scrape your pan and get all of those little bits scraped off the pan, and we're going to also add that to our stock pot water. It adds extra flavor. For the spices, we're going to start with some bay leaf. I'm adding about 4 to 5 leaves. This is a large stock pot. It makes about 2 gallons of soup. We're going to add some peppercorns. I'm just using my hand, but it's about a tablespoon to 1.5 tablespoons. And 1 tablespoon to 1.5 tablespoons of salt for this large of stock pot. I'm going to now be bringing the water level up to about 1 inch below the rim of the pot. Set your heat very low, just to a simmer. This pot needs to simmer for 6 hours. Let's check on the stock and see how it's coming along. This looks perfect. It's simmering, not boiling. This is the way your stock should look when it's completed. Now it is time for us to drain the stock. We'll be removing all of the old cooked vegetables and the beef bones. Now I'm going to finish straining using a finer mesh sieve to catch all of the pepper berries and the bay leaves that are on the bottom. We want to make sure that those are all removed. You don't want this in your finished soup. Round 2 on cutting up vegetables. We're going to be peeling the onions in this section. So I've taken 2 onions and we're going to cut them up into small pieces. These vegetables will be used for the actual soup. I've now cut up more carrots and celery, and now I'm cutting up a few potatoes. We'll also be adding green beans and peas that are frozen later on, about an hour to 2 hours before the soup is completed. Otherwise, these tender vegetables can get overcooked. I've let the stock chill in the refrigerator. I wanted the fat to come to the surface. Now I can remove it with a spatula. Let's put our pan back on the stove on simmer once again and add the fresh vegetables. And now I'm cutting up the meat that's going to go in the soup. I've left it like a medium rare so that as it cooks it won't overcook and be tough. Now let's add some fresh spices. This is some parsley that I grew on my back deck garden. I'm going to use a handful of this dried parsley. And I'm going to use some dill. You don't have to, but I'm using about a teaspoon of dried dill. And about a teaspoon to a teaspoon and a half of garlic powder. While the soup is simmering, we're going to go ahead and make a pie for dessert. I'm starting with approximately a cup and a quarter of flour. I'm using an organic flour. About a half a teaspoon of salt, and about a teaspoon of sugar. We're going to mix this real quick with my pastry cutter. And I'm going to add 1 stick of butter that's been cut into little chunks. We're going to mix this together. Then add between 4 and 8 tablespoons of ice water at little intervals, mixing in between with a fork. I'm going to place this in a plastic bag and put it in the refrigerator. I'll be using 5 Granny Smith apples, and these are organic apples. I'm going to add some lemon juice to the water here, and as I cut the apples, it'll keep them from turning brown. I'll let these soak while I get the pie crust ready. I'm cutting the dough into 2 to have one for the bottom crust and one for the top crust. The pie pan I'm using is vintage. It's smaller. It's perfect for 2. Now I'm rolling out the top of the pie crust. Time for a quick cleanup. And now for the filling. In this bowl I have a mixture of cinnamon, sugar, flour, and a pinch of salt. And I've stirred it together. We're going to add that to the apples. I just remembered I forgot to poke holes in the crust, but that's okay. We can do it right through the apples. We're going to add some butter to the top. And add the top pie crust. All right, we're finished. Now into the oven. Now while the pie is baking, we still have time left to make some homemade fresh bread for our soup tonight. So I'm using about a cup of warm water and about a half a teaspoon of sugar. And here's our yeast, 1 packet. I'm using an organic yeast. And then I'm going to add a little bit of flour. What the flour and sugar do is add some food to the yeast in the warm water. It just gives it a nice way to wake up. Now we'll cover our mixture and let it sit for about 20 minutes. Time to add the rest of the ingredients for our bread. We'll start with approximately a cup of organic flour, and we'll mix that in and add more as needed. We're going to add approximately a generous teaspoon of salt at this point before our dough gets too thick. And we'll switch from the whisk over to a spoon. And we'll just keep adding flour until it turns into a ball and we can knead it. At this point, we will knead it for 2 to 3 minutes. Now, we're going to put it back into the bowl and cover it with a towel and let it raise for approximately 2 hours. Time for a cleanup. Let's give our bread one last kneading and onto the pan for its final raise. This loaf of bread is considered more of a rustic style, and it's perfect size for 2 people. As the bread is having its second rise, we're going to pull the apple pie out of the oven. It smells wonderful. The rustic loaf has been rising with a towel on it for about another hour, and now into the oven at 350. The soup has now been simmering for 4 hours. It needs 2 more to go, so we're going to now add the green beans and peas and a couple more ingredients. And in this old-time recipe, I'm using 1 cup of ketchup. I'm using an organic ketchup. This will make your soup taste like Grandma's. You may have noticed that I do not use bouillon in my homemade soups. I do not care for the extra ingredients that are in those store-bought products. Let's set the table while we're waiting for the bread to finish. I've noticed the temperature dropping and it's starting to snow. The bread's done. It'll be nice and hot for our soup. I think I hear my husband pulling in. Time to cut the bread. Did you save room for pie? I know I did. Today's Bible verse is Luke chapter 15, verses 4 through 7. What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he loses one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one which was lost until he finds it? And when he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost. I say to you that likewise there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 just persons who need no repentance. Thank you for watching Seasoned Living with Rosemary. We are on YouTube and also on Rumble.